Hi, it's Square Coinman here, and today I will talk about the Wisselbank, the Amsterdam Wisselbank. It's an interesting piece of history. Now, before we can come to the Wisselbank, I have to tell that Amsterdam was around 1493 one of the most important trading places in the world. But there was no place where people officially could change their coins because people came from all over Europe. And so people would unofficially meet in the Warmoestraat. And here there's a sketch where you can see people would just meet and exchange money. That means that if you came from Lübeck, you would have your own coins, and if you came from somewhere in Austria, you would also have your own coins. Now, obviously, there's a problem with this because the value of these coins was based on how much silver was in these coins, and this was, of course, more guesswork. By 1561, the people moved from the Warmoestraat to the Nieuwebrug, to Paalhuisje, which you can see here on the right. They had a little half roof, but it was still very primitive and especially very cold in the winters. And here we can see the bridge. Now, by 1602, in the Netherlands, the VOC started, and the VOC stands for the Dutch East India Company. And by 1606, the people that started the VOC decided that they would make shares. So it's the oldest share company in the world. Technically, you could buy a share in the company and get part in the dividend. By 1609, the Wisselbank was started because the problem was still, what is the value of all these different coins that are coming? So they made a place where, one, people could store their money in the city hall of Amsterdam, in the bottom of the city hall, which we can see on the right. And on the left, we can see an edge where you can see that somebody is doing an essay on the silver. So you could come with your 50 coins from Lübeck, and then they would test them and they would say, okay, this is equal to 43 Dutch guilders. Well, we'll show you some guilders. Now, there were three important historical steps here that still have an effect nowadays, because first, it was the first public company ever made. And secondly, one could trade shares or part of companies introduced fiat money, meaning you got a piece of paper and you could use that piece of paper to pay. So it was a very early form of a banknote. It was also very practical because you could have your 500 kilos of gold or silver laying in the bank, and you could still go out and do major trades because the pieces of paper you had were equal to maybe 1 kilo of silver or 2 kilos of gold. On the right, we can see the wages paper that the bank had, how much money they spent, and we can see that the bookkeepers, they get most. For 3 months they get 238 guilders, where the guards get 5 guilders. Now, the bank, of course, had problems every now and then. In 1672 there was a war. France and Germany and Britain attacked the Dutch Republic, and because of that there was a tremendous need of money. So people would go to the bank and get their gold out or silver to use that to buy things. And at that point, it turned out that Rutger Vlieck, one of the bookkeepers we previously could see got 238 guilders per month, had actually stolen 300,000 guilders. Now, this was a critical thing for the bank because people lost a bit of trust in the bank. You expected the bookkeepers from the bank actually wouldn't steal guilders. But it came out, they cut his head off, The family changed the name because this was, of course, a bit of a shame. They moved to Wijk bij Duurstede. Wijk bij Duurstede was a place in the Netherlands where if you had a big debt, you could safely live there because they would not extradite people that had a debt outside Wijk bij Duurstede. So many criminals moved there, and they changed the name to Boelen because Vlieck was obviously not a name that was very good to have. We continue a little bit. Now, one of the very special rules with the Wisselbank was that they would give no credit. Therefore, any piece of paper was actually worth the money that was written on it, because if it says 1 kilo of silver, then that 1 kilo of silver would be in the bank. However, the Dutch East India Company, they had about 100 years later, when the bank was started, already a credit line of 3.2 million guilders. And remember how the guilders look like. By 1700, something really interesting happened. Just 2 years later, it was decided by 3 of the 4 people that were running, or that were controlling the Wisselbank, that it was okay to give an open credit line to the VOC. Now, these 3 people actually were part owners of the VOC, so it was in their interest to give these huge credit lines. Now we jump a little bit in history, and we're now 80 years later, and the Dutch had 4 wars by that time with the British, because the British also wanted to trade the same places as the Dutch were trading. And at the same time, we would see a lot of corruption. Corruption was actually understandable, because what happened was that 1 guilder in the Netherlands was worth in Indonesia about 4 times as much. So every sailor would smuggle some guilders to Indonesia, and then they would buy goods there and smuggle them back to the Netherlands. This was partly because their wages was extremely low and it was risky. Many people died, many ships went under. The second thing that is that they were quite inefficient. When the VOC started, they made a rule that anything that was bought would first be bought and then brought to Batavia, the capital of Indonesia at that time. The reason to do that actually made sense in 1602, because if you buy a bag of pepper 50 kilos, it doesn't make sense to send that to the Netherlands. So what they did was they collected all the goods and would then jointly send them to the Netherlands. However, 200 years later, this was very inefficient, because ships from Ostende in Belgium and the British ships, they could get tea from China 6-7 times per year, whereas the Dutch could only get it 4 times per year, because they actually had to sail a lot more, first to Indonesia and then back to the Netherlands. Now, in 1792, the VOC had a debt by the Wisselbank of 6 million guilders. And Amsterdam, due to the war, had made an emergency fund of 3.5 million. But they didn't have the money, so they just took that from the vaults in the basement of the city hall, which basically belonged to the Wisselbank. This would probably not have been a problem, wasn't it? Because of the French invasion, because Napoleon took over in France and he put his brother on the throne in the Netherlands. When the brother came there, he obviously kicked out the city council of Amsterdam and put new people in place. Now, these new people actually published the economic books of the Wisselbank, because Amsterdam was technically the owner of it. And what happened was that people realized that there is a lot less gold and silver in the bank than they pretend to have on paper. It was the first time in 200 years that these books were published. And anybody that understood a little bit of it realized, I need to get my gold and silver out. So there was a run on the bank, and people demanded their money or their silver back. And this pretty much meant that the bank was kind of bankrupt, because they would give people their silver back minus 10 to 20%. It's a little bit like you put 100 crowns or $100 in the bank, and then a week later you go to the bank and say, well, yeah, you can get your money back, but we only give you 80. To save the bank, they came up with an idea which was quite interesting. They said, well, you know what? Everybody that made a profit out of this should pay. But it turned out that that was actually very, very unpractical, because people had been making profits for 200 years and it was difficult to find out who and what. So then they came up with an alternative plan. They said the 55 richest people of Amsterdam simply have to borrow money to save the bank. And that was actually what happened. Now, luckily enough for these 55 people, the bank made enough profit to actually pay them back. Now, what happened further is that Willem I, who was in England during the French invasion, learned how the British bank was working. And when he came back, he opened in 1814 the Nederlandse Bank. And that bank started giving credits to all kind of business people. And by 1820, he managed to close the Wisselbank. But he did take over, or the Nederlandse Bank took over many of the procedures. Now, I hope you enjoyed the story. Thank you for watching. If you want, subscribe and leave a comment. Thanks, bye.